Good afternoon and welcome to Growing Connecticut's Economy Through Inclusion. It's a Connecticut Mirror event, which is funded by the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut. I'm John Dankosky. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Over the last year, the Connecticut Mirror developed an important series of stories that we called A Better Deal, exploring inclusive economic recovery. We were originally looking to talk about inclusive economic growth, but then the pandemic happened, and we needed to refocus our reporting efforts to think about how Connecticut is going to recover from the economic losses that we felt over the course of the last year. Now, it's no secret that COVID exposed the already significant inequalities in our state. And in many cases, it made them much worse. So as we emerge from the pandemic, we asked people around the state, with an opportunity to rebuild our economy, can we do it in a way that eliminates systemic economic disparities? Our panel discussion will explore the unequal nature of the pre-COVID economy and steps that are being taken to provide greater economic opportunity for everyone. What we need to do to create a more inclusive economy in a more inclusive Connecticut. We sat down with our friends at the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut. They told us they loved this series and would like to have a conversation, but really focus it on this part of the state. I think a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be specific to Eastern Connecticut, Southeastern Connecticut, but so much of our conversation is going to be widely applicable to Connecticut as a whole and also beyond the borders. I want to welcome in our panelists. Bob Wilson is a professor and interim director of the Sustainable Global Cities Initiative at the University of Connecticut. Bob, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Peter Hurst is president and CEO of the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council. Peter, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Leanne Gomes is human services director of the city of Norwich, Connecticut. Leanne, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Bob, I want to start with you because I really want to get our arms around this idea of inclusive growth and inclusive recovery. And from your experience and research, what exactly is it we're talking about first?
I thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I'm relatively new to the state, and this is an opportunity to focus a bit and test some of my ideas developed elsewhere here in Connecticut. But inclusive development is a fairly complex concept. There's a lot of different pieces to it. And it includes, on one hand, income and how income is generated, income distributions. On the other hand, it includes also things about wealth. And the concern has been over the last several decades that our society was becoming more unequal, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic when we see some of the disparities that are a little more common. Resolving issues of inequality can occur through local action, local government, individual community, state action, as well as federal action. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of formulate strategies. And I know today we're going to be focusing primarily on local Eastern Connecticut actions. I think to frame this, I would like to introduce this concept here of the recovery and contrast two different models. One would be a status quo anti-recovery. So this could the southeastern economy of Connecticut look like it was 15 months ago. So that would be the status quo. Are we going to return to that point, or are we going to return to another point, hopefully with more inclusiveness involved? So I'll contrast those two. I think the return to the status quo anti-recovery is very likely. From what I've seen, reading about southeastern economy, southeastern Connecticut, there are some real strengths in the economy. I know we're talking to people that know the area much better than I do, but my impressions are there are some strengths, and these strengths will lead to the recovery. There's the manufacturing and defense sector. There's the cultural, recreational, hospitality sector, the maritime economy. There's higher education facilities in the area. There's a number of things that I think will contribute to the return of the economy. One question is whether or not the status quo anti-recovery is good enough. And from what I've picked up in my reading, I think people in southeastern Connecticut feel that it's not, that we need to have higher aspirations than to go back where we were 15 months ago or 2 years ago. And some of the drags, I think, on ending up in a better place, rebuilding better, as you suggested, Demographic stagnation, that's a real problem. How do we make Southeastern Connecticut a more attractive place where we have influx of people? That's a combination of employment and quality of life. There's stubborn poverty in some of the towns. How can that be addressed? There are two sectors, big sectors of the economy that tend to have low wages. Some of the health services and some of the other kinds of services in the hospitality industry. How should we be thinking about those? And then another issue is looking at the region geographically, enormous disparities across the 20 towns in Southeast Connecticut. This is not a result of the pandemic. This occurred before the pandemic. And this is one of the areas is, do we really want to get back to that spot? Inclusive development has a lot to do with geography, where people live, the nature of neighborhoods, the nature of schools, the nature of towns, the nature of local government budgets, and so forth. And so I think that's something that will be a headwind in thinking about more inclusive development. Mm. Now, on the inclusive recovery side, I think there's some strengths, and maybe what I'll do is just put out a couple of ideas, and then we'll get some others involved in this conversation, because I'm sure there's others have things to say about this. I think the American Recovery Act will have a large impact on inclusiveness. Just as the way it's been passed, as the way it's constructed, as you know, it tilts toward the more economically distressed. I think those are going to have impacts on income, on a whole range of things, on health services in local areas. So I think the American Recovery Act will be beneficial to a more inclusive development recovery. Of course, the problem is it's short term. We don't know what's going to happen 2 or 3 years down the road. So there's a lot of questions around it, but at least as a start, the American Recovery Act is going to help with the employment that I think would probably be happening anyway in Southeastern Connecticut, but also there would be a tilt toward more distressed groups. And there may be some other things also kind of in the environment that would contribute to a more inclusive recovery.
Well, that's excellent. I think that's a good way to start our conversation. And maybe I'll go to you next, Peter Hurst. And maybe a thing to do is to use Bob's framing a little bit here. What do you see as some of the strengths and weaknesses of Eastern Connecticut, Southeastern Connecticut, and the economic situation there right now? Things that you think might bode well for a recovery that gets back to 15 months ago or even better, and things that we have to overcome.
So let me answer that question in a broader context. I think that based on what I do, I run a council that's focused on economic inclusion and minority business development. So I look at this issue of inclusion from the perspective of race. And in this country, is why I want to talk about this broadly, there's clearly a racial wealth gap. And the racial wealth gap is irrefutable. Median net worth of a Black family is about 13% of the median net worth of a white family. Median net worth of a Hispanic family is 19% of the median net worth of a white family. And it's not a moral issue alone. Certainly, that's a very strong driver, but it's really costing the U.S. economy and costing the state, costing the region. Because McKinsey has estimated that, the next 4 or 5 years, the impact of this racial wealth gap is going to be a couple of $1 trillion. So that's real money. So if you drill down by the region, if you drill down by the state, you drill down by, regions within a state, that has an impact. So wealth or the absence of wealth affects a lot of things. It affects where you live, where your kids can go to school, what kind of access you have to healthcare, what kind of jobs you have, and whether you can start a business, whether you can own a home. So fundamentally, I look at this from the perspective that you can't, come out of this pandemic and go back to the status quo, because the status quo was problematic from where I sit. Mm-hmm. Again, the structural inequities played out so clearly in terms of race and ethnic background, in terms of, who got sick, who died, whose children, didn't have the same access to remote learning, whose businesses suffered, whose, because their businesses were suffering, that impact was compounded by the fact that they didn't have the same access to the PPP program. So fundamentally, everything that we saw before the pandemic was worsened by the impact of the pandemic. So my perspective, again, because of what I do, which again is focused on minority business development, we need to think through what minority businesses need, which is similar to what all businesses need. They need contracts to generate revenue. They need financial capital so that they can grow their business. They need intellectual capital so they can run their business as well. So, what I want to see coming out of this, it's been, the combination in 2020 of the pandemic and what happened with, police misconduct and the disproportionate impact on people of color. Everybody became, proponents of, buying Black, supporting Black businesses. So there are a lot of great, letters from CEOs. I want to see, more than conversation. I want to see some real structural changes because, again, and when you think about minority business development, minority businesses, really contribute to communities in several ways. They generate economic output. They create and maintain jobs, especially with people of color. They generate tax revenue. And if you look throughout this country, and if you look especially in Connecticut, the leaders of minority-owned businesses represent a cadre of servant leaders in the communities in which they operate. So, we need to do more than come out of this like we were before the pandemic. And we really need to start addressing some of these structural changes because it's not just something that should be done. It's something that if we don't do it, we're not being smart.
I'm wondering if you could just quickly pick up on this, though. At what level do you think those structural changes need to happen? When we talk about the state of Connecticut, we have 169 different communities. We have different business development districts. We, of course, have the state government. But then, as Bob mentioned, too, the federal government is making an attempt to put an influx of money back into the economy. We need to make sure that that's going into the right hands. I guess I'm wondering, Peter, at what level do those structural changes need to happen in your mind?
Well, I think it has to start, if you think about the drivers for potential change, it's both the public sector and the private sector in terms of, what I focus on, minority business development. The private sector buys more goods and services than the public sector does. The only, entity that comes close is the federal government. So you really need to have leaders in the public sector and the private sector acknowledge that this is a universal problem. It's not an Eastern Connecticut problem. It's not a Connecticut problem. It's not a New England problem. It is a universal problem because across this country, in towns and cities and states, minority-owned businesses are facing those challenges by not having enough contracts, not having enough access to financial capital, not having enough access to intellectual capital. And to the extent that keeps them from generating economic output, it keeps them from maintaining or increasing their employment levels. It keeps them from paying as much in taxes as they should. And it doesn't have the same expanding base of servant leaders. That has an impact, not just on one particular town or one particular region of the state or the New England region. It has an impact on the country. So these are universal themes that need to be addressed because the consequences are right in front of us. The consequences in terms of, not just lost opportunity, lost, hope, but, real economic and financial consequences of having a racial wealth gap.
Leanne, I'd love to pick up with you and maybe you can first just give us a sense of how you see this issue that we're talking about through the lens of the work that you do and explain a little bit about what you do in Norwich.
So thank you. I'm the director of Norwich Human Services, which is a municipal human service department, and we oversee youth and family services, the senior center, the rec department, and we have like an anti-poverty section of the department as well. So I couldn't agree more with Peter and Bob that this pandemic has just exacerbated every problem, every social problem that we had before the pandemic. The income disparity in Connecticut is staggering. I don't know if people are familiar with the ALICE report, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, but Employed. And that's a report put out by the United Way. That report says that the top 1% in Connecticut earns 37 times more than the bottom 99% in Connecticut. And we, because, I'm in Norwich, which is sandwiched in between the two casinos in the area, which thank God for the casinos, because it has brought so much employment to our area, and we would be devastated without them. But when the service industry collapsed, that devastated the city of Norwich. At one point during the pandemic, we had the highest unemployment rate in the whole state of Connecticut, the highest, higher than Hartford, Bridgeport, all of those big cities, because we had so many people tied up in the service economy. And it really disproportionately affected the BIPOC community and women. Women left the workforce, I think 4 times greater than men. So just like we're talking, every problem was exacerbated. If you didn't have internet service or a device to get on the internet, you couldn't, order your food from Amazon like some of us were doing. You couldn't, you can't apply for the vaccination without that. So we worked really hard, and we were able to partner. Full disclosure, I'm a member of the Community Foundation board, and the Community Foundation was actually one of the first to reach out to human services directors to say, what are you seeing on the ground? What do you need? And we were able to get funding to help families immediately, to bridge that digital divide, which is something that I think is so vital to our families right now, and to keep people afloat. I'm really proud of the job that Connecticut has done with different rental assistance and moratoriums on rent and utility shut off, because so many people would just be devastated without that kind of help. But it really did highlight all the disparities in our region, particularly.
And I want to actually follow up with you and ask the same question I asked Peter. But first, I do just want to let our audience know that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. And if you have questions for our panel, I'd encourage you to type your question in there. We probably won't get to all of your questions throughout the course of the conversation, but we'd like to get to quite a few of them. So again, please use the Q&A function. The chat field is also open, but we won't be taking questions out of chat. That's a good way for you guys who are watching to have a little conversation back and forth, but you can put some questions into Q&A. I asked Peter this, Leanne. It sounds like you're both saying, all three of you are saying structural changes need to happen. From your standpoint, where do those structural changes need to be? I'll just preface this by saying, one of the things that we have seen throughout the course of this pandemic is a lot of questions coming to the state government about whether or not they have invested enough in some of the short-term needs that you are talking about, that you see in your office every day, to just get people by. These are not investments in long-term jobs in the region. These are just investments in people being able to survive through something. So with that as a little bit of a preface, I guess I'm just wondering where you see the structural needs are to get back to a better place here.
Yeah, so I would say in wages and in housing, that's what I see on a daily basis. Wages are so low. A single person. So in my town, Norwich, 47% of the people that live here, 47 can't afford to be here. They can't afford rent, food, and utilities all at once in the same month. So they're always borrowing from Peter to pay for Paul. A single person needs to earn $14.45, and a couple needs to earn $22.67 each. And there's only 50% of the jobs in Connecticut that pay more than $20 an hour. 45% of working adults are in this gig economy where they're working 3 different jobs. We're seeing people work, you have a part-time shift at the casino, and you drive for Uber, and you do DoorDash on the side, and no benefits, low wages, you miss 2 hours of work, and you can't pay your rent because you're paid hourly, and you can never, ever get ahead, let alone build assets, which was something that we saw that people didn't have during this pandemic. There was no reserve. They lost their jobs and they were poor immediately. That next paycheck wasn't coming in. So that, I think, is the issue that needs to be tackled. We need to do that. And Connecticut is better off than most states. I think we're going up to $13. We're getting closer to that $15 mark, but we're not there yet. And then the housing cost. the housing cost is exorbitant. For my little town with 48,000 population, 15% poverty, an average 2-bedroom apartment is $1,120. People, my clients pay more for rent than I pay for my beautiful home in a good section of Norwich than I pay for my mortgage. And that is so disparate. And that's not counting their utility costs, which are also, I have people in public housing whose utility bill is more than their rent. So I think we really have to even that out. It's probably cliche to say, but you know, when I grew up, my dad could work one job at Pratt & Whitney. My mom stayed home and raised 5 kids, and we weren't rich, but we had everything we needed. Parents can't do that anymore. You just can't do that in this economy.
Bob, well, let's pick up on that a little bit. So one piece of this that we've heard both Peter and Leanne talk about is wages, sort of the need for people to be able to make enough money to keep up. We'll put aside housing for a second because I want to get back to that. From your perspective, Bob, how do we get at that particular issue? So much time and effort, ink, I suppose, is spilled on talking about whether or not the federal government will finally raise a minimum wage from a pathetically low $7.25 or whatever it is an hour at the national level to something that's closer to a living wage. Connecticut has already started to move in that direction, but as Leanne outlined, it's nowhere near enough, and it's nowhere near kept pace with inflation over the course of time. We probably should have a minimum wage of something like $24, $25 in America. So from the work that you do, Bob, how do you view that issue about getting people in Eastern Connecticut wages that they can live on?
Let me make, before I try to offer some thoughts on solutions, and the solutions are not very good. But historically, this is very much linked to the hollowing of the middle of the labor market, where we've had a lot of growth at high unemployment and we've had a lot of growth in low unemployment. And I mentioned services and some aspects of healthcare before. And this is one of the characteristics that has led to inequalities and is a real issue with inclusiveness, that if the income of a job does not generate enough resources for a good standard of living, that family, those people are just really not fully included in the economy. So the question is, how do we get better jobs on one hand? And then the second aspect is, how do we make sure that our labor force is well trained and well educated so they can aspire to higher wage jobs? And that's very difficult. I just point, there's the big debate about the minimum wage, and it always brings to mind after during the FDR's period, during the recession in the 1930s, we moved to national wages, and it decimated low-wage work in the agriculture work in the South. Displaced a lot of people, but people moved. There was mechanization. Overall, the way that sector of the economy improved. And I'm also reminded, a friend of mine used to argue that what we should aspire to is a Scandinavian economy where there's essentially no wage employment, no low wage employment. That we kind of set a goal, 20 years, we are going to make sure that all jobs are fulfilling, are rewarding, and we just systematically work toward that, making sure that the jobs are being created are better skilled and people are prepared for them. This is a huge undertaking. We just take the health sector. Health assistants becoming increasingly vital. We've seen how they've been affected during the pandemic. Very low wage, generally not sufficient training, no mobility tracks inside those professions. And so this is really a very, very difficult strategy, and it's kind of hard to imagine. It's the area where things like unionization, opportunities for workers to negotiate for higher wages, that's been one mechanism we've used historically in this country. Improvement in the minimum wage would be another, but we also need to think about the employment generation side and make sure there's incentives for good employment being created.
And Peter, this is right in your wheelhouse, so maybe you can pick up on this. I mean, how do we get to the point where we create better wages for people and we start to fill in that hollowed out middle that Bob is talking about, that is so much a part of Connecticut's economy? A lot of growth at the top, a lot of growth at the bottom in terms of the types of jobs we have. In this middle where people would like to exist just isn't there.
So I'll go back to the point about structural change. We have a very irrational and unnatural economy right now, in that not everyone who would love to be an entrepreneur and who would be good at being an entrepreneur has the opportunity to do so. And not everyone who is an existing entrepreneur has the same opportunity to be successful. So my very simple premise, I'm not an economist, I'm an accountant by training, is that if you had more employers that looked like America, because America is getting more diverse, if you had more employers that looked like America and they were given the opportunity to be successful, they would employ more people. In my network, we have 266 minority-owned businesses we've certified across the region. They have, 2.8 billion in revenue, and they have 20,000 employees. 65% of their employees are people of color. So imagine if you could go from 266, and again, this is just a small subset of the total minority entrepreneur, relationship in this region. If you went to 500 and had 40,000 employees, 65% are people of color. I'm not saying, minority entrepreneurs are any more benevolent, but I think there's more of a bond with their employees, because there's not a lot of room between success and failure when you're a person of color in this country. So I think that you could solve a lot of our economic ills if you had a structural change that allowed more minority businesses to start and more minority businesses to thrive.
What would that look like in terms of access to capital? Because obviously that is one of the biggest barriers, right?
Oh, it's huge. Actually, and I actually ran a minority-owned bank in Connecticut, so I tried to do something about it. But there's an issue with access still with bank debt. Minority-owned companies had a real problem getting PPP loans for a whole bunch of reasons. And more importantly, minority-owned companies need access to more patient forms of capital, like mezzanine financing and equity capital. There's not enough of it, because you can't fuel growth with bank debt, because the bank is not your partner. A bank wants to get paid, principal and interest every month. So you really need more patient forms of capital to grow. And minority-owned companies need the same access to opportunities for inorganic growth strategies like mergers and acquisitions, because you could really grow exponentially instead of growing one contract at a time or one customer at a time. That's how other businesses do it. So minority-owned companies need the same opportunity. And one of the things that really would accelerate the structural change is changing our mindsets. We need to think bigger about what minority business can and should be. Not all minority businesses are small and struggling. Some are, that's part of the reality. But there's some minority-owned businesses in Connecticut, in New England, and in this country that are doing incredibly well. In fact, in our network, we're part of a national network that includes 22 other regional councils like mine, 2,000 corporate members, and 12,000 certified minority-owned businesses. The largest minority-owned business in our network is a Black-owned company in the IT space in St. Louis that has 13 billion in revenue. And every year they spend over 300 million by buying goods and services from other minority-owned businesses. So that's part of the reality. So we have to change our thinking, but realize that it's in our self-interest to change our thinking and change our policies, change our practices, so that minority-owned companies have more access to capital, more access to contracts, because that's really going to reduce this racial wealth gap that's really holding this country back.
Mm. Hey, Leon, I'd love for you to pick up on that a little bit, because I think so much of the conversation, especially in your region, when we talk about jobs, is not about minority entrepreneurship or about growth in individual businesses. It's about employment at existing large businesses, right? Defense jobs leave and no one has a job, or defense jobs come back and people have a job. The casinos open up, people have jobs, and then a recession hits and they don't have jobs anymore. And what Peter's talking about is something that hopefully is a little bit more diffused and a little less volatile than hooking ourselves up to an economy that relies on just a few really big employers to give us all the jobs.
Right, right. The city of Norwich has tried to make strides in having entrepreneurial type programs. So I know we did some things under the CDBG grants and things like that. And we have a bond program right now where companies can come in and try to start up in Norwich. So we're trying to do that. I think the problem is risk. That I think it's a very scary thing to do, and to entice somebody to take that opportunity. But yeah, it's just I think focusing too heavily on any type of industry. When we did it with defense, you saw the economy in this region collapse when we focused only on defense. And when that collapsed, the casinos came in. And I don't want us to make the same mistake, with just focusing on service economy. With the pandemic, it wasn't only restaurants, it was the bartenders and the linen companies that washed linens that went out of business. It was just so pervasive. And as Peter was saying, minorities typically fill those jobs, and we're hit hardest.
David writes a fairly long question. I don't think I can read all of, but the lead line, Leanne, is the elephant in the room is of a more inclusive economy is structural racism, which is something that we specifically haven't discussed. I mean, we've talked about it to an extent, but the reality is that is a huge overlay that so many people who you serve, who Peter's working with, that's what they're dealing with at its core, that can't necessarily be solved by a business program or a training program or money flow. It's something that's much more pervasive.
I think that's right, but I don't want to miss the other part of that. And I think this is why the country is so divided right now, right? There's this whole cadre of poor white people who feel that they can't get ahead too because of the structural things. I think the racial aspect is very real and very important and something we need to tackle. But I think we need to see the full spectrum of what's going on in our economy. And it's really the people in the middle and at the bottom. I think wealth is stuck, and I don't think we should want for anything, our families should want for anything in this country, because we have the wealth. It's just stuck at the top and it's not being funneled down. I think businesses had record earnings this year, but my clients didn't see it, and they get up and they work hard every day. They're working 40, 60 hours a week. So I think it's both. I wouldn't say it's just racial issues.
Peter, do you have a thought on that? Go ahead.
Pick it up on that point. I think Leanne's right. I read an article last week that the 10 richest people in this country made an unbelievable amount of money in 2020. Because this is a country now, an economy where if you have assets, which means you have wealth, you can make money even in a horrible pandemic. So fundamentally, it's not all about race, but I think the racial wealth gap is a function of people of color not having the same access to assets that generate wealth. Access to homes, home ownership rates are dramatically different. Not the same access to savings and stocks, because if you're not making money, you can't. It's not because you're not disciplined. If you're not making an X amount of money, you don't have enough to save and put into the stock market. And if you don't have the money to start a business, you don't have the opportunity to take a good idea and do something incredible and make money and hire people and do all of those good things. So really in this country, there's a strong correlation between race and wealth, or the absence thereof. Not the only correlation, but there's a very strong correlation.
I wanted to ask a question that Mary Jo had written here, and Bob, you touched on this, but she asked, what's the best use of recovery aid coming to towns in southeastern Connecticut to support inclusive economic growth? Money coming from the federal government, funneling through the state. How do you best take money that's maybe one-time money and put it in service of doing this thing that we're trying to do here?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Let me just quickly add something to Leanne and Peter's point.
Certainly.
I think Peter, I think both are absolutely right. There are no questions about structural racism. It exists. Looking at the economy as a whole, discrimination is economically inefficient. You're going to have a less productive economy if you discriminate against a group. If groups are excluded, you're going to have a less productive economy. In addition to the economic effects, one of the effects you have with high inequality is lack of social cohesion, political instability, which I think we're living right now. I mean, there's a whole series of things. But I just want to reinforce in southeastern Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken, and Leanne can correct me, I think the majority of poor people are white by a large amount. I think over 50% of poverty are people that are white, and the minority share is smaller than that. The rates are different. The rates are as you would expect, but I think in terms of the numbers, they're higher. But get to this question about the American Rescue Plan. But what the state of Connecticut can do is going to be constrained by the budget categories that were adopted in the act. So I'm not sure how much discretion the state is going to have in terms of funneling money into some areas or not. I'm reassured from what I've read about that is that there's a lot of money going into human services and supporting families, things like childcare and others, improving the income for low-income families, which will, by definition, improve inclusiveness. That's why I'm pretty optimistic about the short-term impacts on inclusiveness of these programs. What's most important? We have that long list of needs. We have infrastructure improvements we need. We got poverty that we have to deal with. We need to expand higher, education opportunities. So there's lots of things that can be done with it. But I think in this particular instance, we're going to be somewhat constrained by the act itself.
I'm wondering, Leanne, do you have thoughts on that? Given that so much of that money is hopefully meant to help people directly.
Yeah, I've never been busier in my whole career than I am right now, because
is that good or bad?
It's good. It's really good. I will be busy every day. There's a lot of money right now. I'm not sure if it will be enough money, but there's a lot of money right now for families for under various different programs. Mostly, well, just about all for families whose income was affected by COVID. So if you were on Social Security and you need help now, it might not be for you. But if you were working, left the workforce, had your hours reduced, had to leave for childcare, there's 4 different programs I can think of that could help you with rent, utilities, internet services, things to support your family. We're doing a ton of food drives. I think the American Rescue Plan really is going to pull some people out of poverty. Just the child care alone is such a big thing for families to afford. Just that help alone, I think, will go a long way to lift some families out. It's, I think there's just this big myth out there that people that need human services are lazy and shiftless or whatever. They are working harder than you and I, and they just can't make ends meet because of structural things like we talked about, housing and wages and the cost of childcare. And I've always said we could eliminate the need for human services if we gave people good quality childcare, if they had affordable housing, and if they had great transportation. That's all people want, is just to have a fair shot so that when they go to work, there's money left over after they pay their bills. They can take their family to the movies, they can buy a car, they can put some money in the bank, and it's just impossible.
So since you brought up housing and wages before, Leanne, we talked a bit about wages. I want to get back to you and talk about housing. One of the things that is being debated at the state capitol, and it's a very divisive issue, is whether or not the state can really force communities that have so far resisted building affordable housing in them to build more affordable housing. The fact is, it's not a great surprise to anybody who's watching this that towns like Norwich in Eastern Connecticut have a higher percentage of low-income housing than surrounding towns. They also bear the brunt of an awful lot of the social service needs that other towns don't have to bear the brunt of. And in many cases, cities like New London, which is incredibly postage stamp size small and has more than 50% of its overall square mileage taken up by nonprofit institutions, so they can't even get any money back from the buildings that are there. It's really, really hard to find ways to make this housing matrix work. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because it's a huge issue right now at the state capitol.
Yeah, well, Desegregate Connecticut is doing great work on that. And I know some really good people who have testified in their favor. So 2/3 of the people of color in Connecticut live in 15 cities. And it's because of zoning regulations that affluent communities have. They don't want two-family houses. They don't want apartment buildings. And that creates the urbanization of poverty, right? It drives people to 15 cities. And services get overwhelmed. People live in crowded conditions. It's just not what we would want. And that's a structural issue. That's something that could easily be fixed by legislation to, I hate to use the word mandate, but to mandate that towns have affordable housing in their communities. And affordable housing isn't like a project or, a housing authority per se. It's really workforce housing, right? So if you live in Stamford, you should be able to rent in Stamford. If you work in Stamford, right? Even if you work at Dunkin' Donuts at Stamford, you should be able to live in Stamford. You shouldn't have to drive 7 towns over so you can find an affordable apartment. That just makes sense. So I really applaud the work that Desegregate Connecticut is doing, and that's a big structural issue for us.
How important is that, Bob, from an economic standpoint, to be able to have an economy where people who work in a town can afford to live in a town?
I'm glad you raised this topic, John. It's very important, and let me just reframe it just a little bit. In southeastern Connecticut, as I understand it, there's 20 towns, 2 boroughs, 2 tribal nations, for a population of 270,000. So if you just do an average, it's about 12,000 residents per government. Very small governments. Maybe they are really good at doing some things, but for other kinds of services, you need larger scale. And one of the other points I was going to make, and I'll just go ahead and make it now, and that is for regional collaboration. I know folks in Connecticut like local control, part of the history, and that's not going to change. But there's still ways that you could encourage collaboration across a set of towns. And there really is no better way of working toward that collaboration than it would be a combination of public housing, or of housing, affordable housing, and public transportation to make sure that people can get to where the jobs are and live close by. I think Leanne's point's absolutely on target. And we have this in Hartford, the policemen can't live in Hartford anymore because it's too expensive. And is that right? Or teachers can't live where they teach. So regional collaboration, thinking about regional approaches to some of these problems, particularly to affordable housing, I think holds promise. And I know that in southeastern Connecticut, in a number of areas, there is regional collaboration. I think on workforce development, there's some efforts there that are regional in nature, but that really should expand, and that everybody kind of in that metropolitan area understands they're part of a regional economy, and that regional economy should be the focus, and the opportunities created. If a single place, Norwich or New London, doesn't prosper, the region as a whole will not prosper.
Both Bob and Leanne just mentioned this, Peter. I'd love to get your take on the idea of transportation as a key driver in this. It's hard for people to get around to the jobs that are there in a place that is so fractured like Eastern Connecticut. There's not one center city, and there's not a transportation infrastructure that takes people in and out efficiently. It's all over the place. You could work, 2 or 3 towns away from where you live. An investment in transportation, long and coming from the state, might well help to solve some of these problems.
Oh, there's no question. I lived in Bridgeport and Stratford, Connecticut for like 13 years. And every time I had to have a morning meeting in Stamford, I just dreaded. You really have a serious problem in this state, and it's not that large. I grew up in Texas, where you can drive 15 hours and you're still in the state. You drive an hour in any direction in Connecticut, you're in another state. But the fact that you have to drive everywhere is a serious issue. One thing that I just want to touch on very quickly that Leanne and Bob opened the door on this. The absence of regionalization definitely has a cost, but the other thing that has a tremendous cost in Connecticut and a tremendous impact on the state's ability to be successful is how we finance public education. You really have every town paying for public education or property taxes. And in those places like Bridgeport, Norwich, where you got a lot of nonprofits, so that means your grand list is not like a place, like Greenwich or Darien, folks in the Gold Coast. That means that children are starting off at a disadvantage because they don't have the same educational opportunities, the same investment in them as a child in Greenwich or Darien and New Canaan. So we got to do something about that. You got to reduce the burden on the urban centers that have more nonprofits. So more regionalization, more formal regionalization is probably necessary, but you really need to restructure the way you pay for public education in the state.
The way you pay for public education in the state. We actually got a question from Liz asking about that, about the disinvestment in public higher education and the burden that's being placed on all residents to sort of to pay for this. Could you talk a little bit more about that, Peter, and the role of higher education?
Well, I mean, certainly higher education is the ticket for most people from poverty to middle class, because hopefully if you get the right degrees, I'm saying that plural, you have an opportunity of getting a job that pays well. But my point is, to even get to the higher education aspirational goal, you need to graduate from K through 12. And if you're a student in the wrong school district in the state, because the way public education is funded, higher education is just a pipe dream. So you really need to restructure, because it's clear that there's a direct pipeline from poverty to at least the potential of something better if you have access to higher education. But higher education is out of the realm of possibility for so many young kids in the state because of the accident of where they live and grow up. And there's something wrong with that.
We actually had an anonymous person chime in on this idea of county government. Connecticut needs county government. They say if Connecticut really wants inclusive development, then they need to develop inclusively. It can't continue to be a town by town effort. It's funny, I hadn't realized both you, Peter, and you, Bob, have spent quite a bit of time in Texas, where a county is about the size of Connecticut, right? I mean, Connecticut would be a county.
I grew up in Houston, and that's part of Harris County. Harris County is probably larger than the
5
state.
million.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Robert Francis writes this a note here. It says, Heather McGee just wrote a book, The Sum of Us, which totally dispels the thought that the economy is a zero-sum game. That is, if Black people get more benefits, I, as a white person, get less. Do you have examples of everyone benefiting from targeted programs to help poor people? That's a question I want to put to you, Leanne, this idea of trying to figure out a way to just make a case to people that actual investment in people's basic human needs, the type that you're able to provide there, is something that is good for everybody. It doesn't take away from somebody else.
It's not rocket science. So if we have people who are homeless and they're living on the street, they're not going to have good health outcomes. They might not have medical insurance. They go to the hospital. Who pays that? We all pay that. They might end up in prison. Who pays that? We all pay that. So to me, it's so, and I've always told my staff and interns this, that people that don't like human services should look at the business side of it, right? If you're all about fiscal responsibility, look at what makes fiscal sense. And if we took care of everybody, right, we'd all be better off financial, because the cost for not taking care of people are spread out amongst us all anyway. That those bills have to get paid, those hospital bills, it's just not rocket science. To me, it's just very simple. And whether you're the most liberal person or the most conservative person, you should take care of everybody because it makes sense on both sides.
I totally agree. I mean, it really isn't rocket science. Very simple. if most of your paycheck goes to keeping a roof over your head, that means you're not going to spend money on goods and services. If you're making more money, you're going to spend more money. And if you're spending more money, that's going to be good for the economy. So I'm not an economist, but it's real simple. It's so clear to me that if you could do something to allow people to make more money, allow people to have, you know, mechanisms to create more wealth, it's going to benefit the entire country.
I'm wondering if in the last couple of minutes that we have, we could maybe from each of you get a couple of thoughts about solutions that you think might actually work. And we've got a couple of people here who are saying, look, a lot of our conversation sounds like, you know, if we have money coming in from the federal government or money coming in from the state government, how do we spend it? How do we spend money to make sure these things happen? And not every problem can be solved by just throwing money at it. Bob, I suppose I'll start with you. What's a solution that you see to help Southeastern Connecticut, Eastern Connecticut, by and large, grow beyond that 15-month period that you were talking about, get beyond where we were before the pandemic, but actually grow in a way that's sustainable and also inclusive?
I would encourage the development of a regional vision for Southeastern Connecticut. So there are a couple of organizations that look at that region, but creating a vision that is comprehensive, that incorporates people, that can be used as a guide for state governments. I think Peter raised this point earlier on, that there's a lot of our fellow citizens that aren't convinced that inclusiveness is a good idea. And forming a consensus around that everybody will be better off if we take care of, to make sure opportunities for prosperity exists for everyone. We haven't even touched the intergenerational mobility topic yet. Huge topic, and it's very much tied into the things we're talking about. So I think trying to create a vision, a common vision shared by others, and then let that move into the government arena, so that there's a new way of thinking about the region rather than 20 individual towns, that there really is something that only can be done with a regional view. I think that is where I would probably place priority.
Peter, how about you? What's a solution you'd like to bring to the table to say this will really help us get out of this situation and come out better after the pandemic?
This is the one time I'm not going to talk about a universal thing. I'm going to talk about something that is very specific and local to this sector of Connecticut. If state and local governments stop doing what happens with big companies, like when everyone was recruiting Amazon, they were offering millions of dollars in tax breaks. Let's take a different approach to business development. Let's look at the fact that commerce has no borders. So why not attract small and medium-sized companies to this part of Connecticut that can sell across the country and give them the resources they need to be successful, which in the short term are capital, contracts. I go back to it for businesses. That's real simple. So if you, instead of trying to keep GE from leaving, going up to Boston. Now Boston is probably wants to send GE back, but very seriously, if you have a different focus on economic development, let's say, keep businesses here, start businesses here, nurture businesses here that can sell around the country, but employ people right here. That to me is a very simple solution.
And it's so interesting you say that, of course, too, because probably of all the parts of the state, Southeastern Connecticut has had some of the biggest problems with that. Our investments in Pfizer, and Pfizer loses a whole bunch of jobs. Our investments in the defense industry shrinks. And then the casinos, of course, the casinos are a different matter, but still we're relying on something that is a one big ticket item that's only going to exist right there. And it's not all these little small businesses that you're talking about.
That could sell across the country. I mean, don't focus on an economy where the local business has to sell to the local population. Focus on a structure where local businesses can sell across the country, sell their goods and services. That's something that's worth investing in and supporting.
Leanne, I'll give you the last word on this. What's a solution you have? What's something you can leave us with to think about?
I agree with Peter and Bob. I am such at a micro level. I think these guys see things more macro, and so I will defer to them. And I'm just really, I feel very educated that you have educated me, Peter and Bob, on this topic today. So I just really appreciate having been here.
Well, while I have a minute with you here, let's go to that micro level, Leanne. On that micro level, what do you think is a solution is? I mean, you're in the city of Norwich, you're dealing with people
Yeah.
who need help every day. I mean, what's something that you think needs to be done to come out of this better than we were before?
Higher wages. I mean, people are working hard. Wages with benefits, give someone a decent wage for working 40 hours so that they can live their life and be fulfilled.
Leanne Gomes is Human Services Director of the City of Norwich. Leanne, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
I want to thank Peter Hurst, President and CEO of the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for having me.
And Bob Wilson, Professor and Interim Director of the Sustainable Global Cities Initiative at the University of Connecticut. Bob, thank you for all your expertise and thanks for your time today.
It's my pleasure.
I really want to thank our partners, our friends at the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut. We've got another event coming up with them sometime later on this spring. We're going to be talking about an entirely different issue having to do with the media, with literacy, having to do with just understanding our civic responsibility as people. It's something that's a lot on our minds here in Connecticut and all around the nation. I want to thank them, of course. I want to thank our publisher, Bruce Putterman, for helping us put this together today. And I want you to please continue to go to the Connecticut Mirror to read stories about inclusive economic growth and about what's happening at the state capitol. If you want to see events like this that we've had in the past, or this event, once we've archived it, you can go to ctmirror.org/events. You can sign up for some of the other events that we have coming up as well. And don't forget, by the way, to subscribe to our podcast, Steady Habits. Conversations like this are often rebroadcast as part of Steady Habits, a regular conversation where we try to do what we just did, which is try to see how we can make this state work just a little bit better than it does right now. Thank you all so much for your time. Please have a great afternoon. Be safe and be well.